Chapter 1, The Arrival. The old manor had stood for centuries on the outskirts of the sleepy village of Ravenswood. Its stone walls, worn and weathered by time, loomed over the surrounding forest like a sentinel from a forgotten era. Legends swirled around the estate, tales of madness, disappearances, and restless spirits. But to Julia Whitaker, it was an escape, a sanctuary from the chaos of her life in the city. She arrived at dusk, the sky a canvas of deepening purples and oranges. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and the rustle of leaves seemed to whisper secrets long buried. As she approached the manor, its windows dark and uninviting, a chill ran down her spine. Her footsteps echoed on the stone path leading to the grand entrance, where a pair of massive oak doors stood half open, as if awaiting her. Inside, the manor was a labyrinth of shadowed corridors and grand rooms filled with antique furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Julia's footsteps disturbed the silence, the creak of the wooden floorboards announcing her presence. She found the light switch, and a flickering chandelier cast an eerie glow over the foyer. "Home, sweet home," she muttered, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the place. She explored the ground floor, her fingers brushing over the surfaces of forgotten heirlooms and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. One painting, in particular, caught her eye, a woman with a striking resemblance to Julia herself, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed almost alive. As night fell, Julia settled into the master bedroom. The four-poster bed, draped in heavy velvet curtains, looked inviting despite the dust. She unpacked her belongings, feeling a sense of unease gnawing at her. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the branches tapped against the windows like bony fingers. She tried to shake off the feeling as she prepared for bed. The journey had been exhausting, and she needed rest. But as she drifted off to sleep, the manor seemed to come alive around her. The walls groaned, the floors creaked, and in the distance, she could swear she heard faint whispers. Julia's dreams were filled with shadows and cold, clammy hands reaching out to her. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding, and listened intently. The manor was silent, but the feeling of being watched lingered. She glanced at the clock, midnight. Her eyes were drawn to the window, where a figure stood in the garden, staring up at her. Julia's breath caught in her throat. The figure was indistinct, shrouded in darkness, but its presence was undeniable. She blinked, and it was gone. "Just my imagination," she told herself, though the words felt hollow. She lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin, and tried to calm her racing heart. But sleep eluded her, and she spent the rest of the night staring into the darkness, feeling the oppressive weight of the manor's history pressing down on her. Chapter 2, The Discovery. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Julia felt a heaviness in her bones, the result of a restless night. Determined to shake off the unease, she decided to explore the manor further. Perhaps understanding its history would help her feel more at home. She started with the library, a vast room lined with towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and leather, and the silence was almost reverent. As she perused the titles, her fingers tracing the spines, she came across a journal bound in worn, red leather. The name Eleanor Ravenswood was embossed on the cover. Curiosity piqued, Julia settled into a high-backed chair by the window and began to read. The journal chronicled the life of Eleanor, the woman in the portrait who bore such a striking resemblance to Julia. The entries started cheerfully enough, detailing Eleanor's daily life and her love for the manor. But as the pages turned, a darker narrative unfolded. Eleanor wrote of strange occurrences, the sound of footsteps in empty corridors, doors that opened and closed on their own, and the constant feeling of being watched. Her handwriting grew more erratic, and the tone of the journal shifted from curious to fearful. She described dreams filled with shadows and whispers, similar to those Julia had experienced. Julia's heart raced as she read the final entries. Eleanor wrote of a figure that appeared at night, watching her from the garden. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread and believed the manor was trying to claim her. The last entry was a frantic scrawl, "I cannot escape. It is here with me. I fear what it wants." Julia closed the journal, her hands trembling. The similarities between Eleanor's experiences and her own were too striking to ignore. She needed to know more. She spent the day delving into the manor's history, searching for clues that might explain the haunting. In the attic, among boxes of old clothes and forgotten toys, Julia found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The letters were from Eleanor to a man named Thomas, who seemed to be her lover. The correspondence revealed a love affair marred by tragedy. Thomas had been killed in a hunting accident on the grounds of the manor, and Eleanor was inconsolable. One letter, written shortly before Eleanor's death, stood out. Thomas, I feel your presence here, yet it is twisted and dark. The manor is alive with your spirit, but it is not you. Something evil has taken root here, feeding on our sorrow. I fear it will never let me go. Julia's mind reeled. Was the manor haunted by the spirit of Thomas, twisted by the tragedy of his death? Or was there something darker, more malevolent at play? She needed answers, but the more she uncovered, the more questions arose. That night, as she lay in bed, the sense of being watched returned. She could feel eyes upon her, a cold, oppressive presence that seemed to fill the room. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep, but the whispers began anew. They were closer now, more insistent, and they carried a message she could not quite discern. In the dead of night, Julia was jolted awake by a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed, bolting upright, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. She glanced at the window, and there, in the garden, was the figure. This time, it was closer, and its eyes, dark and hollow, bored into hers. Panic surged through her. She couldn't stay here, but where could she go? The manor held her in its grip, and she felt as if she was losing her mind. As the figure vanished once more, Julia knew she had to uncover the truth about the manor's dark past before it consumed her. Chapter 3: The Haunting. Days turned into nights, and the oppressive atmosphere of the manor weighed heavily on Julia. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with their sinister murmurings. She tried to ignore them, to focus on her research, but the sense of dread was inescapable. The manor seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, and Julia felt her sanity slipping away. One evening, as she sat in the library surrounded by old books and documents, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. The shadows deepened, and Julia felt an icy hand brush against her cheek. She gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice trembling. A gust of wind answered her, whipping through the room and scattering papers everywhere. The whispers intensified, forming words she could barely understand. "Leave, now, before it's too late." Julia's heart pounded. She knew she had to leave, but something compelled her to stay. She was drawn to the manor, to its dark secrets. She needed to understand the force that haunted her. That night, she dreamt of Eleanor. In the dream, Eleanor was running through the manor's corridors, her face twisted in terror. She was fleeing from something unseen, something that seemed to consume the very air around her. Julia tried to follow, to help, but she was rooted to the spot, unable to move. She awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was pitch black, the air thick with a palpable sense of malice. Julia felt a presence in the room with her, and she could barely breathe. She reached for the bedside lamp, her fingers fumbling in the darkness. When the light finally flickered on, she saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent fire, and its form seemed to shift and waver. Julia's scream caught in her throat as the figure lunged at her, its cold hands wrapping around her throat. She fought for breath, her vision darkening, but then the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Gasping for air, Julia scrambled out of bed and ran to the door. She flung it open and fled down the corridor, her footsteps echoing through the manor. She found herself in the library, the place where she had felt the most at ease. The fireplace crackled to life on its own, casting a warm glow over the room. Julia sank into a chair, her heart racing, and tried to calm her nerves. The whispers returned, but this time they were different. They were clearer, more coherent. "Find the truth, set us free." Julia's eyes fell on a large, ornate mirror hanging above the fireplace. She had always avoided looking into it, feeling a strange aversion to her own reflection in this place. But now, she was compelled to approach it. As she gazed into the mirror, her reflection wavered, and she saw not herself, but Eleanor. Eleanor's face was etched with sorrow, her eyes pleading. Julia reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the glass. The room seemed to warp around her, and she was pulled into the mirror, into another time. She stood in the manor as it had been in Eleanor's day, grand and full of life. She saw Eleanor, vibrant and happy, before the darkness took hold. Then, she saw the tragedy unfold, Thomas's death, Eleanor's descent into madness, and the malevolent force that fed on their grief. The vision faded, and Julia was back in the library, the weight of the manor's dark history pressing down on her. She knew what she had to do. She had to find the source of the evil and put an end to it, for Eleanor, for Thomas, and for herself. Chapter 4: The Confrontation. Armed with the knowledge gleaned from Eleanor's journal and the visions from the mirror, Julia prepared herself for the final confrontation. She knew the source of the evil lay deep within the manor, in a place hidden from prying eyes. The basement, long sealed and forgotten, held the key to breaking the curse that bound the manor. The entrance to the basement was behind a heavy, ornate door in the kitchen. Julia had avoided it, sensing the malevolence that seeped through the cracks. But now, she steeled herself and approached it, her heart pounding. With a deep breath, she grasped the cold, iron handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Julia took a lantern from the kitchen counter, lit it, and began her descent. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of damp earth and decay filled her nostrils. She reached the bottom and found herself in a vast, cavernous space. The basement was filled with relics from the manor's past, broken furniture, crates of old clothes, and forgotten family heirlooms. But in the center of the room was an altar, crudely constructed from stones and wood. It was covered in dark stains, and a cold, unnatural light seemed to emanate from it. As Julia approached the altar, the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. "Leave, now, before it's too late." But Julia pressed on, determined to end the nightmare. She saw symbols carved into the stones, symbols of ancient rituals and dark magic. This was the source of the evil, the place where the manor's curse had been born. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and Julia felt a presence behind her. She turned and saw the shadowy figure, more solid and menacing than ever. Its eyes burned with hatred, and it seemed to draw power from the altar. "You cannot stop me," the figure hissed, its voice a cacophony of agony and rage. "I have fed on their sorrow for centuries. You will join them, and I will be eternal." Julia's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. "I know who you are," she said, her voice steady. "You are not Thomas. You are the darkness that took him, that twisted his spirit. And I will end you." The figure laughed, a sound that echoed through the basement like the wailing of lost souls. "You are weak, like the rest. You cannot defeat me." But Julia had a plan. She had found a passage in Eleanor's journal that spoke of a way to break the curse, a ritual that required courage and sacrifice. She placed the lantern on the ground and began to recite the incantation she had memorized. The figure howled in rage, its form shifting and writhing. It lunged at her, but Julia held her ground, continuing the ritual. The air crackled with energy, and the light from the altar flickered and dimmed. As she finished the incantation, a blinding light erupted from the altar, enveloping the figure. It screamed, a sound of pure anguish, and began to disintegrate. The light grew brighter, and Julia shielded her eyes, feeling the oppressive weight lift from the room. When the light finally faded, the figure was gone. The basement was silent, and the air felt lighter, purer. Julia collapsed to the ground, exhausted but victorious. She had broken the curse. Chapter 5: The Liberation. In the days that followed, the manor underwent a transformation. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the whispers ceased. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and the air was filled with the sounds of nature, birds singing, leaves rustling in the breeze. The manor, once a place of darkness and despair, felt alive again. Julia spent her days restoring the manor, breathing new life into its ancient walls. She cleaned and repaired the rooms, uncovering the beauty that had been hidden for so long. She felt a connection to Eleanor and Thomas, their spirits now at peace, and she honored their memory by preserving the manor's history. One morning, as she was tending to the garden, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. Her heart skipped a beat, but as the figure stepped into the light, she recognized him. It was Thomas, his form no longer twisted by darkness, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice gentle. "You have freed us." Julia smiled, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. "I couldn't have done it without Eleanor's help." Thomas nodded. "She was always strong, even in the face of despair. Now we can rest." With that, he vanished, his spirit finally at peace. Julia felt a sense of closure, knowing she had helped to end the suffering that had plagued the manor for centuries. As the days turned into weeks, Julia embraced her new life in Ravenswood. The villagers, once wary of the manor, began to visit, curious about the changes. They spoke of the legends, of the haunting that had kept them away, and Julia shared her story, hoping to dispel the fear and mystery that had surrounded the manor for so long. The manor became a place of gathering, of laughter and light. Julia hosted events, inviting the villagers to celebrate the history and beauty of the estate. She felt a sense of belonging, a connection to the community and to the manor itself. And on quiet nights, as she sat by the fireplace, she would think of Eleanor and Thomas, their love and tragedy, and the darkness that had nearly consumed them. She felt their presence, not as a haunting, but as a comforting reminder that they were finally free. The manor, once a place of horror, had become a sanctuary of peace and remembrance. And Julia, once seeking an escape, had found a home where she could heal and grow. The shadows that had plagued her were gone, replaced by the warmth of the past and the promise of a brighter future. In the end, the manor had given her more than she could have ever imagined, a sense of purpose, a connection to history, and a newfound strength. And as she looked out over the grounds, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.